So today is going to be the last presentation of today, of this series of lectures, and also today. And the main goal is really to talk about how to do presentations. So you see, the key point to understand is that presentations and papers have different roles. Presentations, in a sense, are easier to prepare, but then, in a sense, in particular, if you already prepared the paper, but then you have the complication of being involved in a one-to-one interactive session. So, as I said, today I'm going to talk about how to do presentations. Presentations are different from papers. In a sense, they're easier to prepare, but then the key part of the presentations is really how to manage the interaction with the audience. And so I'm going to concentrate here in this talk only on some basic tricks, some fundamental aspects of how to control the audience and make sure that your presentation gets through. And so I'm assuming that we all know and you're already practicing. You're already practicing the work how to do papers, but just to reiterate, let me just say that in a presentation, the game is still the same. You still have the problem of conveying to your audience the problem, the solution, and the impact. And of course, exactly as for papers, all of these, as I say later, depends on the audience, depends on the message you want to convey, and so on. So nothing new. One paper, one message, one presentation, one message. You have to make very clear what is your unique selling proposition. And so this is the given. So I'm assuming that all of these, everything that I said for papers, applies to presentations. Clearly, as I said, presentation, there is the live dimension, and so there are different aspects which play a role. And and I'm going to go through some of them in some detail, all right? So as I said, this was the slide I was talking on before. I mean, everything as before concerning presentations, everything as papers. But as I said, there are different aspects which really are related to how you deal with the audience. And I'm going to go through them or some of them in some detail to give you some basic tricks so that you can avoid making mistakes when you talk and give presentations. So there is a bunch of issues. And I urge you to go through all of them one by one. But now let us consider the most important in this talk of mine. So first of all, the fundamental issue when you give a presentation is that when you give a talk, you must be sure you're in control of the audience. You must be sure that the audience follows you. And this, I think, is a key point. And you're not talking to yourself. You're talking to an audience. And you must be sure for what you can and for what you're good at, because, of course, there are different skills here, that whatever you talk gets to the audience who understands. So, for instance, a common mistake that I've seen sometimes is that, for instance, not anymore, but for instance, some people talk looking at the screen, or some people talk looking at the board. No, you have to talk to the people, and not only that, you should really move around and talk to different people in different times. Otherwise, if you look at only one person, that one person after a while gets tired. So all these issues, and also the other ones don't really feel they're part of the presentation. So the key point on the presentation, differently from papers, is that really during the presentation must be sure that the people follow you. And of course, this depends on the presentation methods. So, and this that I'm doing today is a seminar, but I think looks more like sounds more like a lecture. And but I think that when you get into a presentation, you should be very aware of the type of presentation you're going to give. And here there are like 4 kind of prototypes of presentation. They are different. So lecture is pretty much when, like now, you teach something, and therefore you expect to get questions, not so much to challenge you, but to ask for clarifications. When you do a seminar, sometimes a seminar is a presentation where pretty much you're assumed to teach something, most likely more advanced, like in a research issue, or for sure, like seminar, like in a lecture, something that the audience doesn't know much about. But clearly, while in a lecture, the attitude is that of a teacher with respect to someone learning. In the seminar, it becomes more peer-to-peer, and therefore you can get deeper questions and tougher questions to answer. And then, of course, we have, depending on in a standard presentation or in a seminar, then there is an issue which is fundamental when you want to have the discussion. So, for instance, let me give you an example. In the PhD, the rule is that, even I think in the qualifying, in that most of the cases they ask you questions at the end, but then can ask clarification questions during the presentation. So whether or not we're going to have a presentation, a discussion, and questions at the end or at the beginning is actually an important parameter. So you see, in all of this, the key aspect is that the key variable of based on which you plan your presentation is the interaction modality with the audience, which is actually the key aspect, which differentiates a presentation from a paper. See, in a paper, whatever you write it remains in writing, and therefore you can't deny it. In the presentation, there are only words. Words fly, disappear. But during the presentation, you must be able to show that you know what you're talking about and be able to control the process. And by the way, as I always said, in a presentation, it's okay to say that you don't know something, and there are standard ways of doing this. You can say, this is out of my research topic, this is a good future work, this is out of my research area, I saw this, but I did not get into the details. So in a presentation, if someone gets to ask a question which is tough, it's perfectly okay, up to a point, of course, to say that you don't know something. But what is not okay, as I said many times, is that you make a claim that turns out to be wrong. There is nothing worse in a presentation, in a qualifying, in a PhD presentation, to say that you know something, make a claim, and then the audience, or just showing that you're wrong, or not even that you're wrong, that your claim was imprecise. So all this issue of being very careful in what you say is crucial. If in a paper I gave you the trick of thinking or reading the paper from the point of view of the reader, here in the presentation, the challenge in a sense is even tougher, because you have to give a presentation, but as I said in the previous slide, you have really to be in control of the audience. You have to make sure that you know what you're telling them, you ponderate, you think very carefully the words, so that in the end, you don't run into the situation of having to acknowledge that a statement you made is wrong or partially wrong. In all of these, the presentation method, the one which is actually tougher to manage is the one when you get questions during the presentation, because first of all, they break your flow of interaction, and you have to react in real time, and then you have to be able to get back the presentation where you want. The control effect of taking the presentation where you want is fundamental. I mean, exactly as in the paper, you have the unique selling proposition, you have to say what you want to say. In the presentation, you have to make sure that in the end, you communicate what you want. For papers, but even more for presentations, there is a fundamental rule, which is a variation of the one paper, one message, or presentation, one message. The question here is, suppose that someone comes to your presentation, and suppose that at the end of the talk, which means when this person remembers the presentation, you should ask yourself, if someone asked the person listen to my presentation and asked this person, what did you learn from this presentation? What was the most interesting part of your presentation, right? You should think of your presentation in a way that you maximize the probability that the person asked this question will answer what you want, your unique selling proposition. So what is my unique selling proposition in this presentation? My unique selling proposition in this presentation, to give an example, and by the way, this is easy because I'm in a lecture modality, so I'm not getting many questions from you, is that I want to argue that presentations is pretty much the same problem of writing papers, which is you have to argue your problem solution and the impact factors, but at the same time, the game for doing it is completely different, and the key difficulty is really in keeping control of the audience by talking, which of course, in a presentation like today, is not nice. It's much harder to do because I don't see you and you don't see me. So we will all have to learn different ways of doing this. But ultimately, these are the key features. One aspect that I didn't do today is that at least when you have this kind of presentation modalities, you see the face of the speaker or some of the listeners, but I don't have this in this modality. Anyhow, so these are the presentation methods. And this actually, the next one is actually very important because suppose that you give 1 hour of presentation, there are two aspects. Number one is for how long you need to prepare for talking. And number one with the preparation, for the time of preparation. So the point here is that the lecture, if you go to the book, the lecture is pretty much when you do like you do 1 hour lecture, then I think you can assume that you can talk for like 45 minutes, and then or like 50 minutes. So give them only 20% of your time to the answers and to the discussion, which means if you see from the slide, well, you have 1 hour presentation, 1 hour preparation. And in fact, in Europe, this is what is considered standard. If you have to teach, even in Trento, if you teach 15 hours, people assume that you need 15 hours of preparation. Of course, this 1 hour preparation means that before the lecture, you know what you're talking about, because if you need to study, then it's gonna be much more. But assuming that you know what you're talking about, and these are all times in this lecture which assume that you know what you're talking about, 1 hour presentation, 1 hour preparation. And then if you see, if you go from the bottom to the lecture to up to the open discussion, the time of discussion grows from 20% to 30% for presentation with final discussion, 60% for presentation for intermediate discussion, 80% open discussion. And interesting enough, you will notice that even if you have to talk less, you need to prepare more. 4 hours for the open discussion down to 1 hour in the lecture. Why so? Because of exactly what I said at the beginning. Even if you go to an open discussion, it's not that you go into an open discussion and you just get the discussion to go wherever you want. You just want the open discussion to go in a direction so that at the end, people, when leaving the discussion, we say, okay, I've learned this. The unique selling proposition I learned is this. Clearly, the open discussion is much less predictable. Clearly, when you have an open discussion, you cannot anticipate as much what you want to say, but still you have to have some control on what is going on. For a typical example of open discussion is what in conferences are called panels. I don't know how many of you have gone to panels. And my opinion on panels is usually like an open discussion, usually lasts like 1 hour and a half. There is a moderator and 2 or 3 people discussing and then question for the audience. Panels are the maximum that you can think of involvement of the audience. Remember, let me repeat that in presentations, the key aspect is how you involve the audience. Well, in my point of view, in all my experience now being pretty old, is that there are only 2 types of panels, very good or very bad. And very good is that the ones where you see the panelist, the coordinator, the one driving the discussion, really was able to direct the different points of view into some kind of a coherent perspective. And clearly, when you have more open discussions, clearly everybody is different. Everybody has his or her own point of view, and therefore it's hard to make sense of what they say, and therefore it gets more confusing. But at the same time, it's also the time when you have different perspectives and an active audience. Even when you give a presentation yourself, the more you have an active audience, the more people can learn. Of course, by then the magic becomes a famous synthesis. It's synthesis everywhere from what different people said. So the bottom line of this is that, to conclude this part, is that when you make a presentation, you really have to, first of all, think very careful on how you want to manage the presentation to make sure that you have a unique selling proposition, and then how you're going to handle the interaction with the audience. And clearly, this gets out to the second point, which is attitude towards the audience. So I already said, we already dealt with this issue in the paper writing. We call them invisible colleges. I mean, the audience is everything. I mean, like, if you know everything, but you're not able to communicate, what you know is irrelevant, worthless. And this is even more in the presentation. And the key point in the presentation, this applies in particular to your PhD exam, applies to the presentations to the group. So the question fundamentals are, who is the audience? The fundamental question here is, how much do they know with respect to what you know? No matter what you know, there are things they know more than you, and if you're good enough, there are things you know more than them. So remember that you're at the beginning, the fundamental issue of not getting caught in some claim that you can't support. This is why what they know is fundamental, because you have to be very careful in the statement that you make in front of the audience. And also in what they are interested in, what they understand. I mean, like, clearly, if you have in front of you someone who's done like machine learning for all his life, he's going to ask you about machine learning. And someone's done NLP, the same, and so on and so forth. So you will have to be very careful, and in particular, make sure that they don't get sidetracked in their own line of thought. So suppose that, for instance, you have someone in the audience who is expert in machine learning, and you have done some of it, but it's not the core of your PhD, of your work, of your research. Then the usual trick here is this person can ask a question, you follow it, you follow the person, you follow the question, but at a certain point, you see exactly the kind of example where you say, no, this is out of my research topic. I'm not focusing on the machine learning, but for instance, I'm focusing on the KR aspect. So this idea of having boundaries and being careful in the boundary what you say is fundamental. And by the way, just for this, is that in the same way as an attitude towards questions which is open makes the talk harder, also an audience which is kind of open in the competencies is going to be harder to handle. So if you go to an audience where people know only about something like computer vision, about KR, you know the audience, you know what to expect. If you get an audience like our group, which is kind of more widespread, you can get questions from different perspectives. And again, I'll consider this as a feature in the sense that getting questions from different perspectives is good because it opens your mind. At the same time, it's harder for both the audience to ask questions and for the person giving the talk to answer. But the bottom line here is, again, even if suppose that you've done your work in your PhD, suppose that which means you already know everything. I mean, you already done your work. You've done 1 year work, so what you know is clear. The same material needs to be presented in different ways. If given in front of a class of students like you, in a research group which is in your research area, in a research group which is very sectorial, and so on and so forth. The crucial aspect of audience is really one of the key aspects in the presentation. And of course, when you do this, you have to really make an effort to integrate, as I said at the beginning, the audience in your presentation. Right. Like here, eye contact, I'm not very good at that, I don't know, but for sure, simple, understandable language. By the way, simple, understandable language means simple, understandable language for the audience, not from you. So it's interesting when you go to certain now machine learning papers or like some communities where they get very technical, like telecommunication, I think is the area where I saw most of this. They all talk about acronyms. And clearly, I saw papers where just one acronym every line. I mean, acronyms, if you use an acronym, you must be sure that the audience understand the acronym. I try always to avoid as much as possible with acronyms, unless they are very well known, because they are not simple and understandable. Number two, there is a key aspect in the presentation. You have to make your unique selling proposition true, like concentrate on what is very important, and clearly you have to be credible in what you say. Don't pretend to be an expert in AR when you're an expert in machine learning, and so on, and so forth. And clear the reply, being able to reply to objections is actually key. But I already told you that there are standard ways of doing it. The key point, as I said, do not pretend you know more than what you do. In particular, when you're young, nobody thinks that, consider me, I'm old enough, so when I give talks, I have to be a little more careful. By your age, your expertise, you're allowed to say, reply to an objection saying, I don't know. You're not allowed, as I said, to say, pretend that you know something that you don't know. So this is when you give the presentation, but then how to select content, right? So these are different modalities. There are different slide modalities. So for instance, there are certain, for instance, you can prepare slides and you say then the slides are documentation. So if you prepare slides as documentation, then usually you write slides which are very thick with a lot of text. So one standard way of writing documents is that you write slides because slides give you a more like a synthetic perspective. You're forced to split by slides and so on. But the slides which are for archive or providing content are not the slides you should use for a presentation. So in a slide for the presentation, and it's something that people sometimes don't understand, the slide of a presentation should be pretty much empty. Now, remember that anytime you give a talk, like now you're talking to me, you're listening to me, I'm talking to you. There are two aspects. You're listening to me and you're reading, right? So, and the optimal effect is that while I'm talking, you read, because all of you are reading out the slides and listen to me, and you're able to switch back and forth between what I say, what you read. You're able to do it. Actually able to make sense. So this is what you need to obtain. So this means you don't put too much into a slide. Because if you put too much in the slide, then people read the slide. If they read the slides, if they're like an entire paragraph to read, they will read and not listen to you. You put pictures, because pictures, they say one picture is worth 1,000 words, because they give you the impression. Okay? And they pretty much, another key point, is if you have to give a concept, you have to put in the slide, you have to put in the slide only the key keywords, the most important words. And by the way, something that sometimes you don't do, when you write slides, what you write in the slides is not needed to be syntactically correct. For sure, there must be short sentences like this. And for sure, the reader, the listener and reader should be able to see these slides, understand the slides almost in 1 second, and be able to map what the speaker is saying to what the reader and listener listens. And so the key aspect is really, you don't want to say too much. You don't want to put too much in a slide. You see, when you write a presentation, in a sense, it's easier than when you write a paper, because in a paper you have to give a full argumentation, while in a talk you have to give the key aspects. You really have to give the main message. I mean, you see, people can read what you write 100 times. People listen to what you said only once, unless there is a registration as today. So people really have to understand what you're saying. So you have to be very focused. And it is perfectly okay if you don't write in the slide, and if you don't talk in a complete way. But at the same time, you should be aware that if you don't say anything, if you don't say something, then you may get a question. So for instance, one way of handling this, which I think is a very good presentation planning, is that when you do this, because for instance, you're switching something and you're dropping something, you're not saying some details, you may do that on purpose. You may make some kind of slightly bold looking claim so that you get a question, and then beforehand you prepare an extra slide, and when you get a question, you show the new slide. If you're able to do this, then you win, because the listener wanted to understand, you show the slide. So this issue of the auxiliary material is a very good idea. My standard way of suggesting presentations is that you have a begin slide and an end slide. When I give presentations, as you find out in these slides of my lecture now, usually the first slide is the same as the last slide, with my name and the title of the talk. And then once you have the last slide, which is the same as the first slide, then you put all the auxiliary material, the auxiliary slides after that. And when you have that, you're able to switch from one to another. Actually, for some of you who are sophisticated, you can even put an hyperlink. We can allow you to go from the slide, from one slide to the slide forward and backward. This is fundamental for the single slide, but I want to say something, which is when you do research, and you do research for like 1 year, and you have you've written the paper, you published the paper, for instance, you're making a presentation of the paper. Clearly, as I said, there is no hope. You can say everything. And as I said, you have to select what to say, and for sure, you should work hard in selecting those parts of the presentation where your unique selling proposition or your key ideas come more explicit. So suppose that you have three topics where all the three, which are both all of three equivalent for the point of view of the unique selling proposition. Some of you, in particular with no experience, or some of us, I should say, is irrelevant. Really, what you do, you just use all of them and you present all of them. But you have no time. So this is exactly when you try to present too much. There are three ideas, all of them are important, you want to say them, and what happens then is that you have no time, you present all of them very fast, and nobody understands anything, and for sure, what you presented sounded like a list, did not sound like a full explanatory idea. So what do you do when you're in this situation? When you're in this situation, what you do, you say somewhere in the index or in some internal slides, you say, look, this is the key idea. The key idea has been applied in these three areas, but given that I have no time, I'm going to concentrate only on once. For the other two, if you want to ask questions, I'll be happy to ask questions. Which is, again, do not want to do too much. It's not only about writing too much in a slide. It's not only about writing single sentences. It's also about making sure that you focus and concentrate only on a small number of aspects, giving you the possibility of explaining all the features from your point of view. Let me remind you that in particular, when you've written a paper, people can always go and read the paper. So suppose that you go to a conference. So what is the goal of a presentation? Remember when we were writing papers, we asked a question, what is the goal of the title? The goal of the title is to make the reader read the abstract. What is the goal of the abstract? And so on. The goal of the abstract is to make the reader read the introduction. Now, what is the goal of the presentation? The goal of the presentation is to be able to give the listener the key idea so that ultimately the listener will, number one, come to you and talk to you, which is the biggest success, which means he wants to or she wants to interact with you, or he reads your papers. So presentation, not something that you do to explain everything, is something that you do to introduce your work, and even more, introduce yourself, introduce your interest, introduce your positioning to the audience. So, as I said, really in this presentation, the key aspect is really to attract the attention of the reader on what you're doing and saying in your work. So, so these are just tricks, few words in each slide. I'm just giving concrete example. I already said that before. Few words in each slide, no complete sentences, bullet points. Remember that in my presentation of how to read, on how to write papers, I argued in the last presentation how bullet points are fundamental for structuring the paper. Well, in a talk, this is even more important. I mean, to me, slides are only bullet points. To me, the only thing which are not bullet points in a slide is a quote or a general message by the large minority. And clearly, animations, graphics, are fundamental because they give the message. And also they are, I mean, like, interesting to see. You have to remember, I said that before, that in a presentation, the listener has to do two things: read the slides, listen to the audience, listen to the speaker. So the slides cannot be too dense. The slides cannot require full parts of the entire sentence, because if the person reads the slide, then he doesn't listen to you. The slides, what you write in the slides, are not something to be read. as such, as something which supports what you're saying. So if you think about it, the way I'm giving this talk now, I actually read some of the parts, but what I'm talking about when I talk, even only rarely reading the sentence, I will talk about the what is written in the slide. So what is written in the slide is some kind of anchors are kind of like bullet points, and then which if when I talk should be make concrete what I say while talking. So to conclude, each slide is fundamentally something which will help the reader, the listener and reader, to make sense of what the speaker is saying without catching too much of his time. And one more thing which is fundamental is each slide must be self-contained. Each slide. So in a paper we say that the paper has to be self-contained. In a slide, it's just hopeless to hope that if I give a presentation, all of you pay attention to me all the time with the same intensity. Of course, there is sunshine out. Of course, someone near you does something. Of course, maybe an email comes around. So of course, you're going to lose attention for some time. Now, the fact that people don't pay full attention to the time is okay. The fundamental question from the speaker point of view is, suppose they don't pay attention to me from 5 minutes, how much time will it take me to get them back in track? How much will it take me to make sure that after having got considering something else, they will be back understanding me, right? So this is why, like the numbering of lectures, showing the numbering numbering of the titles of the slides. This is why reiterating the index are good tricks, because you want to say to the reader and listener, oh, by the way, we are here. You remember this is what we're talking about. This is a talk on how to give presentations, and I started from the audience. Now then I started from the unique selling proposition, and now I'm going to talk about how to do the concrete slide. If you do this, then the audience will get the most out of it, and then in the end, some of them will come and ask questions, and some of them will get something home from what you said, and maybe they will read your paper and use your results. Of course, now going to this, how you introduce the introduction, how you start. You start with the introduction. The introduction usually is really get the reader, the listener to the point. I usually put an index, as I did this time. But this time, you remember, before the index, I put one slide reminding you that even in the presentation, we have the what, why, and how problem. Okay, so what was my goal? My goal was, by the way, we're not doing something new. We are still in the same game, right? But we just had a slightly different task, which is no longer to write a paper, but to give a presentation. So that was the introduction. Sometimes you can, the introduction, it can be the state of the art, sometimes it can be the problem. I usually do them after the index, but sometimes I even put the problem statement before the index, up to you. When you learn how to do it, you can do whatever you want. Still, the issue is that you have to have some kind of warm-up into the presentation. Right, who are you? Well, yes, okay, we are you, right? So this is interesting, the who are you question when you have a presentation, because when you get the PhD student going abroad, what the person does, the person reads, the title of the talk is, I did that all the time when I was young. The title of the talk is, my name is, and that comes from blah, 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 the institution. Well, right, that's good. I would think that you can do better than that. For instance, instead of reading your name and reading maybe your co-author, maybe it would be better to say something about you. You can say, oh, this is part of my PhD work. This is very interesting. I'm interested because of this and this. Become a little more personal without losing professionality in the work you're doing. All right. And this is actually the key point about the issue that I don't know where I got these slides from a friend of mine, and I don't know. I think this is actually psychologically proven, but pretty much you see now we are towards the hope that we'll end soon modality, which is if you say this is what people happens when you give talk, right? Initially people are kind of warming up, then they get to the maximum attention, then they get tired, and they rev up again. They become a good modality when the time has come for the end of the talk, and they need to prepare for the questions, right? So this is why also pretty much you should try to be predictable in the length of the talk, which by the way is not something that they did in this series of talks, my fault. But clearly, if you are predictable, you can actually exploit this curve to get the maximum out of the question that you get from the users, from the listeners. Right, then there is issues. Some of you are worried. Well, what can I say? I mean, if you're worried, then you should change job. I mean, unless you learn. I mean, you have just to go and talk. There is nothing, it's like any other job. It's like cooking. So you can do it, and it's just a matter of practicing. And by the way, this is now why I'm asking you and Xavier to start organizing talks. Now I gave a lot of talks. I did my homework. Now for 5 years, I don't need to talk anymore. Just joking, of course. Now it's your time to see how you go. And of course, as I said, there are two games today. There is a game of the person giving the talk, and then the game of person asking questions. And again, I would like to see a little more activity on asking questions. I mean, if you get some practice asking questions, there's nothing to worry. There's no such thing as a stupid question, as long as you think of the good question. And you need to practice, and it's something that we need to practice, all of us. Clearly, certain cultures have a time in asking questions, but let me tell you, asking questions is really the best way to learn how to give presentations and how to do research. So all of you, please, in the future, ask questions. And of course, the way to do it is just to prepare, right? I mean, now you have to, how do you prepare? I said that many times to you. You have to rehearse. You have to rehearse and you have to learn. And you find out that after the second time you rehearse a presentation, pretty much it's kind of more almost automatic drive. I want to I want to talk about now using pictures. A couple more things before going towards the end is really pictures, graphs, symbols are fundamental. As I said already, if you use text, you should minimize the amount of text. The text should not syntactically correct, but a picture like a graph or some like evaluation or something is exactly what makes a difference. And exactly as in the papers, the presentations, the schemas, the pictures, the bullet points, the evaluations are the course going structure. Here exactly pictures and figures are the fundamental ones in building a talk. So you should at the beginning, when you prepare a talk, organize at the beginning which pictures and figures you're going to use. Because let me remind you, I said it implicitly at the beginning, a talk, exactly like a paper, is a composition of what, how, and why, or better, why, what, and how. And the right balance of why, what, and how is up to you, depends on the topic and so on and so forth. But as I said at the beginning, everything I'm talking to you now is about how to present the why, what, and how. But the why, what, and how, you have to structure exactly as you do it when you write a paper. So all we are talking about now is after having prepared the slides. But the slide preparation is pretty much the same as writing a paper. Clearly, if you build slides out of papers, you have a competitive advantage. Why? Because in the paper, you really did the hard work of the synthesis. But when you get to go the work of the synthesis from paper to the whole synthesis in the slide, as I said before, is again a lot of hard work. Why? Because you have to simplify. You have to be able to be understood in words. And this is exactly why, in the same way as they play a big role in papers, figures and pictures and symbols and drawings play a fundamental role also in presentations. And then there are people who can, if you're an expert, you can play jokes, you can be practical, and so on and so forth. And you can draw parallels and so on. All of this is okay. This is rather sophisticated, up to you if you can do it. I don't have much to say about this. This really boils down to personality. Some of you are really able to do this. Some of you have hard time, up to you, up to your side. Ultimately, exactly as there is a style in writing papers, there is also style in making presentations. Playing with the language is really something which requires expertise, and that some of you will do better than others just because of what you are. Now, I want to spend this slide now, which is what we keep. So, suppose that we have the asked question. Suppose that you do something, right? What do we keep about what you've done, right? And then again, these results come from some psychological analysis. Clearly, you learn 90% if you do it yourself, right? And this is what you do. So if you do something as research, you don't need anybody to tell you. You know exactly what you're doing, right? But then the second part, which is saying that once you know something, those of you who have had some experience in teaching, as I usually say, there is nothing better than teaching in order to learn something. And it's interesting when you teach that sometimes while you're teaching, you realize that something that you thought you understood, where there was some kind of missing detail that you underestimated. And again, exactly as a teacher in the lecture, if you find out that something you did not realize, to me the best way to do it is I didn't realize that. Next time I'll tell you, even to students. But the point is really that first you learn by doing, then you learn by reporting, but then the next step is really learn by going to a talk. And going to a talk, you learn much, much more than reading. Some of you think you read a paper, you learn. No. I mean, by going to a talk, you learn much more. According to these results, you really learn like 5 times more, which is very clear. This is obvious. I mean, like you have someone who has done the work for you. You have someone who is an expert who has selected the most important parts. So this is exactly why coming to these seminars, and giving seminars is fundamental. And this is exactly why I'm pushing to do that. And in the near future, I'll push you even more, because listening to talks is fundamental, but not that listening to talks, hearing and seeing. You hear the speaker and you see the slide. And both of them the sum of them is just the sum of hearing and seeing. But then the point here is that in order to get a cumulative effect of hearing and seeing in a talk, and not only hearing, not only seeing, you have to do the slides, so that actually the slides allow the user, the listener and the reader, the user of the talk, to really do both hearing and seeing. Because as I said before, if your slides become too complicated, then the reader will become just a reader reading the slides only without paying any attention to what you say. We become just a hearer, just reading what you say without reading the slides. So this balance between writing the slides and being able to talk is fundamental when you give a presentation. Now, and then there are questions. Questions are very much welcome. I said before, they should be answered as soon as possible. And some can also be delayed or forward to someone else. So delayed, what it means? For sometimes you get a question and you say, look, I understand your question, wait 2 slides, I'm gonna raise this issue later. This is typical. Sometimes when you get someone expert, you can get like a question which is in the future of your talk, in the next half an hour or so, next 10 minutes. Or the other option is, right, this question is about machine learning. The machine learning is being done by my colleague. Maybe you should ask him, or maybe if he's in the audience, you can ask him to provide answers. The key point is that you should avoid interruptions. I mean, interruptions is different, because question has a constructive flavor, while interruptions has a negative flavor. So sometimes you get, to me, it's only happened a couple of times in my life, you get someone negative who really keeps asking a question and wants to push you. Then when something happens like that, which is very, very rare, to me only happened a couple of times, you should be able just to say, I'm not going to answer to you. And at most, if you want, you can answer, I can answer you at the end of the presentation. So the key point I'm saying is that once you have agreed, or you have decided, agreed with the audience, the question modality during the presentation, at the end, question answering open and so on, I think you should just stay on track with questions and avoid interruptions. And you should be able to stop interruptions if and when, in those rare cases where you have to do this. And then there is the final discussions. And the final discussion, to me, goes as follows, which is, this is my last talk and last presentation. So you did not ask many questions in these presentations. As I said, from now on, it will be your time to do the homework by giving presentations. And also, if you want, there are 2 ways by which I'm happy to answer questions. Number 1, by talking to you in person, and by the way, by revising your papers and also presentations. But also, if you want, if you're able to collect a good set of questions, we can have like an open discussion with all of you in the next presentation. So remember that we said at the beginning there are many types of presentations. Then there are panels, there are open discussions, so on and so forth. I'd be very happy to sit in an open discussion on a panel, but someone else has to drive the discussion. Someone else has to collect the questions, and someone else to do this. This is another modality with respect to just asking questions on a personal level. I think would be very good, but the only way to do it is that you do the homework and you ask me to participate, and I'd be very happy to help in this. But module this stuff, this is the end of the presentation, and this is the end of my cycle of presentations. And I have nothing more to say now. It's up to you to do your homework. Thank you very much.